Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay, coming to you today from Amherst, Massachusetts. We're at the Perry Institute. We're likely to see more austerity measures rather than more stimulus given the shape of the new House. Yet, based on American government estimates, 14 to 15% of the American population is living in poverty. Much of this has to do, some say, with the minimum wage. Joining us now to discuss how we might raise the minimum wage and what the consequences of that might be is Jeanette Wick-Slim. You're an assistant research professor here.
Right.
So what has your research shown you, first of all? What is the situation in terms of the numbers and what's happening in terms of people working on minimum wage?
What we did in this research, this new research with my co-author Jeff Thompson, is we actually tried to think about a way to raise the minimum wage and a combination with the earned income tax policy, a way to raise them up to a decent living standard. So we're looking at two different policies.
Just break it down for a second. So over here is just a federally mandated higher minimum wage.
Right.
And over here, describe what this is over here.
Right, the Earned Income Tax Credit. It's a federal program that subsidizes the working poor's income through the tax system. And so basically what it is, it takes a percentage of a worker's income and says, we're going to give you that amount. It's specifically 40% is the most generous benefit. 40% of a worker's income is given to them through the tax system. And this
is a program that's already in place.
Yes, this is a huge economic policy that was put into effect actually during the Clinton administration to, quote unquote, make work pay. The idea was to subsidize low-income households' incomes to raise them to a more decent living standard because, there's this assumption that their earnings by themselves.
This is what some people called workfare. It was a way to get people off welfare and give some motivation to even take lower paying jobs.
Right, exactly. So during the Clinton administration, there's this huge welfare, reform, which basically, wiped out the AFDC, which is the traditional welfare, program, and replaced it with a much more restrictive program, which is called TANF. Once that was done, the Clinton administration proposed this. Well, we're going to raise the minimum wage. So if you recall, in the 1996, 1997, the minimum wage went up in 2 steps, and also did a huge expansion of the EITC program. So the idea was, okay, we're going to raise the wage floor. We're going to raise the minimum rate that employers can legally pay their workers. But on top of that, we're going to subsidize the income of working poor households because we're going to say, well, if you are working, we're going to give you an income subsidy. In that way, combining those two programs, that would get these households to a more decent living standard. So in the research paper that we just completed, what we do is we look at these two programs and assess, do they actually get families up to a decent living standard? And we already knew going into this project that they don't. And our idea was, well, let's take seriously the notion that work is supposed to pay, that's supposed to support a decent living standard. What would that require of the policies? And could there be a reasonable proposal put on the table to actually do that? And so that is what we do.
Now in your paper, there was a number, 80 some odd % of people at minimum wage are not earning enough to actually pay for the necessities of life.
Right.
So that's people who are benefiting from the programs that exist. It's just not enough?
We take a look at what's the current policy situation. So right now, the federal minimum wage is $7.25 an hour, right? Now, if a person is working 2,080 hours a year, which is full-time year-round, they would make on order about $15,000. So, think about, okay, was that $15,000 going to support a decent living standard?
I think most people can get that. $15,000 a year, is not, especially if you got kids, is not a decent living standard.
Right. But, there is some small portion of low-income working households that might be able to be supported based on the current policy rate, minimum wage rate, and a combination of the Earned Income Tax Credit. And what we find is about 12% of working households, low-income working households, would actually be able to support some notion of decent living standard. So that's, the flip side of that is, there's a vast majority of low-income working households, on the order of 90%, could not support a decent living standard based on current policy.
So what's the proposal look like?
So we first come up with what would be a reasonable, an ambitious but reasonable increase in the minimum wage. And we come up with a 70% minimum wage increase, which gets us from a $70.25 federal minimum wage currently up to $12.30. Across the states, states vary in their minimum wage rates. Some are higher, some are lower, so it'll vary a bit state to state. But generally speaking, for the vast majority of workers, you'd have the minimum wage floor rise from $7.25 to $12.30. And the other part of the proposal is to expand the EITC program, the federal EITC program. What we say is, well, we should increase the benefits on the order of 80%. Currently, the maximum benefit is about $5,000, so this would raise that maximum benefit to about $9,000. And then we'd also expand out the income eligibility for the households.
So roughly speaking, the people that we're making in the area of 15 a year What's an annual income at the end of this blended program?
Their earnings would go up to about $26,000. And then on top of that, they would get, again, depending on the household, they would get on the order of $9,000 in earned income tax credit. So that would get them to something on the order of about, $35,000 in income.
So this is a massive jump of income, relatively speaking, for people who have been earning 15, they get into the low 30s. So what's the economic consequences of this? Obviously, the first question is, how do you pay for all this?
Of course, the most popular argument against the minimum wage is that if you raise minimum wage, employers' costs go up, they lay off their workers, or they cut back on their hours, and the workers you're trying to help end up getting hurt in the long run. So we took this argument seriously, and we have at Perry and other places have done a multitude of studies to see, well, when the minimum wage goes up, what actually happens. And what we often find is that when the minimum wage goes up, that the cost increase that businesses actually experience is relatively modest compared to their capacity to cover these costs. And we quantify this. So, for example, something like the citywide minimum wage increase in Santa Fe that was being considered in the early 2000s, they considered a minimum wage hike up on the order of 65%. Now, that actually translated to a cost increase for restaurants in that area, in the types of businesses that would be most affected by this increase, on the order of 3 to 4% of their sales revenue. So, if you want to think about it in very practical terms, restaurants would basically have to raise their prices by 3 or 4% in order to fully cover the cost of this minimum wage increase. So, as a restaurant patron, you'd be seeing something like a $20 meal go up to $20.60. So the cost that is associated with the minimum wage increase is very often modest.
And then in theory, there's a lot more people can now go to restaurants and buy food because they're not making 15 grand, they're making 30.
We don't take into account this idea that all of a sudden there's this income being generated in the economy that produces more demand. I think a more persuasive way to look at that argument is that the minimum wage and the earned income tax policy credit program, both those policies combined can help start making an institutional framework for a more equal income distribution. And in that sense, if you have income distributed more equally, you'd have a much more robust economy, and the consumer demand would be much more stable. It'd be very healthy, it'd be very robust.
And if you're going to put stimulus dollars somewhere, why not, I guess the argument, put them here? They're going to get spent more quickly, is the theory, rather than tax cuts or something.
Right.
Well, how much does this cost? People are in their heads are just going to do the math that labor costs just went up maybe 70%.
Exactly, that's wrong. First, labor costs are only one portion of business costs, right? So it's something on the order of half or 30% of business costs. Now, if you look at the percentage of workers within a business that would actually get a raise, on the outside figure for restaurants would be on the order of 50% of workers. So, and then the last component is that even those workers, the 50% of workers who are earning minimum wage or something around that, there's a spectrum of wages, right? There are people who are earning the very bottom, the minimum wage, and then there's people who are earning near but above that. So they don't get the full 70% minimum wage increase. So those three factors combined.
Because a lot of people might already be making 8 or 9 or 10, so the increase is not that much to get to the 1235. Okay, now about the tax credit part is going to come out of the government. So how much is that going to cost?
The total cost increase would be $51 billion. Now, currently, the federal government spends about $51 billion in tax credits for the federal EITC program as it currently stands. So our expansion would basically double that. That'd bring it up to about $51 billion. So again, like we looked at with minimum wage, we want to say, well, is that reasonable? Is there some way that the U.S. economy could absorb that kind of a cost increase? And so when we looked at the $51 billion price tag for the expansion of the EITC program, we looked to the federal budget, because that's where the money's coming from. What's the capacity for the federal budget to pay for a $51 billion expansion? So when you look at $51 billion relative to the federal budget, you're looking at something on the order of 1.8% of the federal budget. So you're trying to figure out, can you shift around 1.8% of the federal budget to this program? So yes, of course this is something that's a matter of political priority. For example, one thing that we could do is we could take, what is currently the annual increase in the military budget, take 1 year of that increase, and that would fully pay for the $51 billion that would be the cost of the expansion of the EITC. Another example is if we created a modest income tax for households making more than $100,000 a year, that would be able to pay for this EITC expansion. And when I say modest, what I mean is if we set a tax increase that was equal to their annual average growth, if we just took 1 year's worth of that money and we put it towards
And
the
the scope
ATC
of
program.
the entire budget is pretty small. It's a small amount of money. It's more about the question right now, the political climate is, pay down the debt, reduce the deficit, not one more penny. But it becomes a question of priority, whether
It's
getting
exactly
people
a
out of
point of
poverty
priority.
matters. And number two, whether you actually have more purchasing power in the economy matters or not. And clearly, if you're going to be spending stimulus money anyway, it would make sense to put it into people's hands that would spend it.
This isn't specifically about a stimulus package, but this is about policies.
But doesn't it amount being that? I mean, doesn't it amount to that?
Well, you could think of it two ways. You can either be shifting resources around in the budget, or you could be spending more money, so adding more to the deficit. So what we're proposing is different ways that the federal budget could shift money around or increase taxes by a very modest amount for for high-income households. That way pay for these programs. Not that we have to create this new spending program, but actually change our priorities.
Have you done any work on what is the ripple effect in terms of wages, and is there any inflationary effect as a result of that?
This is something I've looked at for a long time, and basically what the ripple effect amounts to for the minimum wage is that it's fairly limited. It does exist. When you raise the minimum wage, workers who earn above the minimum wage also get an increase. So, but still, in all the cost estimates that we provide in the research, when we tally up what it would affect, how it would affect businesses, we always take into account ripple effect raises. If the minimum wage went up by 70%, we're talking about 4%. Okay.
We're going to have a link to your paper underneath the video player, so if you click somewhere down here, you'll find the whole paper. And we're going to ask you, when people write in and start screaming, "Oh, she can't be right about this," you'll answer their questions.
Yes.
Okay. So write in and scream if you're inclined to, and Jeanette will respond to you. Thanks very much for joining us.
Yep.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.